Hey everyone, I'm at a rock concert. Look at all these guys back here. They're jumping around, they're cheering, they're trying to get the band, my favorite band, rock band. They're trying to get this band to come back out. They just finished their set. We still haven't heard some of the big hits, surprisingly enough. So they're cheering, trying to get them come out and play some of their big hits. Me, I'm just going to stand here. Doesn't matter if I cheer. I could stand here, relax, not expend any extra energy. And that band, considering how much these fools are jumping around, they're going to come out anyway. I'm going to enjoy the music, and I'm going to be a lot more rested when that music starts to play. Oh, here they come. Now let's rock. Hey, sorry guys, I'm a little tired. I was out a little late last night. This video we're going to be talking about two of the main explanations of one of the more pressing questions of civil war, which is why people rebel, with the focus on greed and grievance. So I'm mostly going to talk about greed here, and in the other video I'm going to be focusing more on grievance. So, and in that video, make sure that you schedule enough time. I'm basically reading, I am reading the horizontal inequality reading for you and talking about it as I move through it. So it's actually a long video. It's about an hour and 45 minutes. And so, yeah, schedule your time appropriately. So let's talk about greed models and also kind of why some people choose the greed explanation over the grievance explanation for why why civil wars occur. So greed models dismiss grievance as an explanatory factor. Now the question is why? So the key dismissal of grievances as an explanatory factor is that everyone has grievances. So, I mean, I don't know if any of you celebrate Festivus, but for those that do, you know that there's an entire tradition in Festivus dedicated to the airing of the grievances. And because grievances are so ubiquitous, there has to be, in that case, another explanation as to how those grievances transform into rebellion. So the argument isn't that grievances don't exist, but it's just that because they're so omnipresent, they can't serve as an explanatory factor. It's the general rule that if you're trying to explain something that varies, you can't explain that with something that doesn't, something that's a constant. So if grievances are perceived as a constant, it can't be an explanatory factor. So the greed models, they focus mostly on the collective action problem and how this is resolved and how different opportunity structures increase the likelihood for a rebellion. So what's the collective action problem? So first of all, the little video that you saw at the beginning of this lecture, right, is a demonstration of the collective action problem. I'm at a concert, the concert is over, people want to hear more music, everyone's chanting and cheering for more music. I serve as a free rider. I can just stand there and not do anything as long as everyone else is chanting and cheering. Then I'm going to be able to hear the music no matter what. So I get the public good. I get the benefit of the cheering, but I didn't do anything for it. So I essentially am a free rider. So the collective action problem exists in a lot of theories in which there's any sort of element of mobilization that's involved. So rebellion, by definition, is an act of mobilization. So the question that we are asking ourselves, why would you mobilize when for a rebellion, if you don't need to, if enough other people mobilize, you still get the benefits of the rebellion, but without the risk and without the cost. And so this becomes the key element that the greed models are trying to solve. So what do I mean by a public good? So a public good is defined of something that's it's something that's not excludable from others. So if I am, so if you build a road, right, a public road, that becomes a public good. We can all use it. It's not, it doesn't matter how much of your income was paid in taxes versus somebody else. You could have been a tax cheat and not even paid a cent of taxes, and you can still use the road. You might go to jail for something else, but it won't be because you used a road you didn't pay for. So, and so with rebellion, right, you're looking at this question of mobilization and how do you get to the sufficient level of mobilization to overthrow the bad government? So this is obviously risky, and so it does create the conditions for a free rider problem. You can minimize the risk and cost by not participating, but you're going to get the benefit of the public good if everyone else does. So this really, like I said, isn't a problem if one schmuck decides to free ride, but if everyone does, and why wouldn't they, as we're all governed by the same logic, then the desired outcome would not be reached. So, like I said, a lot of Civil War studies will engage with this question. And in the classic economic model of the free rider problem, one of the solutions is to create private incentives to rebel. And this could be side payments, special benefits to those who participated versus those who did not. And also giving people who are part of the guerrilla forces access to certain lootable goods. And so it creates sort of this rational choice model for rebellion. So one thing that I do want to kind of focus on, though, right, is this question of what do we mean by being rational? So what rationality assumes is that individuals have a set of preferences and they're going to be making those decisions based on those preferences plus their calculation of what they think others will do. So rationality is strongly rooted in these questions of strategic decision making, right? So if we can think about it with the game of chess. So if I'm playing chess, I prefer to win. That's certainly a preference, but my opponent also prefers to win. So in terms of making my specific choices, the choices that I'm going to be making are choices that I think bring me closer to that specific goal. Now, I'm not a very good chess player, and so the amount of strategic thinking I can do about the strategies that my opponent might use is fairly limited. And if I'm playing somebody who's like kind of at my level, that's going to be the same thing. So, we might get some outcomes where I win some and then she wins some, and we get to and we kind of draw even back and forth with one side winning and one side losing, every time. But if you watch masters play, if you give two master chess players all the time that they need to calculate the moves and what all the possible counter moves might be made, you're going to see a lot of draws. And I actually looked up the statistics, like in masters chess play, over in the last couple years, like 75% of chess matches have ended in draws. And so if you have perfectly rational, calculating beings who can calculate another strategic actor's moves into the future, you're not going to actually see, uh, and as especially if they're evenly matched, if they have like the same set of resources, they're going to kind of, you know, tie each other in their strategic moves. So, but that's kind of the core model that we think about with rationality, is that these moves are being made to try to reach your best outcome based on your calculation of the strategic moves that an opponent is going to be making. So what that means then, right, for sort of a rational collective action problem is that your free rider is making a strategic choice. They can maximize their benefit with while minimizing their cost. And so when we start thinking about these questions, we start thinking about, say, the entrepreneur, the rebel entrepreneur who wants to recruit people into his cause. And so that's what the greed model is trying to demonstrate, is that there are certain ways that rebel groups and certain conditions and opportunities that some groups are afforded that give them a better ability to carry out a civil war or rebellion. Um, and so some of these, and so if you, I'm not going to go through, point by point here because you have the reading. I think the reading is very clear. I want you to make sure that you're spending time going through the entire video for the other reading, right? But just a few things, right? One is that you keep your group small. So small groups are easier to control. You can give with small groups, you can give private or selective incentives that can be used to control people to participate. One argument is that with impoverished people, they're not drawn to rebellion because of grievance, right? But because being poor makes it easier for rebellion entrepreneurs, so to speak, to be able to provide incentives with very low opportunity costs. Kind of the what do you have to lose argument. You're already poor. Here's an incentive. Certainly there's some risk associated with participation, but right, what other possibilities are there for you? So other studies now. One thing I should kind of point back to the Hoffler piece. She's the co-author with Collier on many of these, and they work for the World Bank. And so one of the things that is also important to understand is that sort of the funding for this research is kind of being driven by an institution whose organizational model is to look for monetary mechanisms by which to solve these problems, right? So while I think their research is sound, I think they're not. There's nothing nefarious going on within their research. There is, there were incentives for them, particularly to kind of shape their research to be able to fit policy models that make sense for the World Bank. I think there's a lot that we can draw from the Collier and Hoffler research agenda, but it also allows us to kind of think, well, why wouldn't they be focusing on grievance explanations if, because those become policy problems that fall outside of the purview of what the World Bank would be able to sort of conceivably do. So one of the things that their studies have shown, and also studies by Furon, right, is that countries that with higher per capita income, larger populations, and are primary commodity exporters, these types of countries are more likely to experience civil war. And a lot of their research has been on the primary commodity export aspect of those findings. And the reason for that is because that provides a pretty solid explanation that fits the greed model, right? So what we mean by primary commodity exports, these are things like oil, diamonds, minerals, types of narcotics like coca or poppy, right? These are items that can then be converted to cash. Being able to control these resources, this allows rebel leaders to make side payments. This allows rebel leaders to be able to sustain their fight against the state. So if you take the FARC, for example, in Colombia, obviously the FARC, after the end of the Cold War, you saw a number of Marxist, leftist, revolutionary groups come to the bargaining table, negotiate a ceasefire, a peace agreement, because they had lost their main supporter of the Soviet Union. Well, the FARC continued going. They just recently signed a peace accord many years after the Cold War, and one of the reasons they were able to keep going, right, was that they had access to cash through participating within the narcotic economy, the black market economy around cocaine, mostly in terms of taxing farmers who were growing coca. So when there's a lot of these commodity exports in a country, it really creates an incentive for rebellions to capture those commodities. And that's kind of a greed explanation. It's like, that's not an ideological explanation. You're not doing it because you're driven by sort of ideology or a specific grievance, but that you can enrich yourself by taking over territory that has these commodities on them. Now, one of the real questions also that's kind of attributed to this is, a lot of times there's kind of this assumption in this literature that you're looking at government as a public good, that people aren't joining the rebellion because they're free riders, but it's obviously more complicated than that. The government itself isn't necessarily in its entirety a public good. There might be public goods that the government is providing, but even in some of the most equal and I guess you could say benign governments, there's still levels of inequality that exist with the distribution of those public goods. And we're talking about things like clean water, clean air, education, defense, transportation, infrastructure, and other forms of infrastructure, right? If you even think, in our country, right, with education. Education, if we look at it as a public good, everyone should have access to education. But when you look at different communities and resources of education, educational resources within those communities, there's clearly disparities that exist among them. So I think one thing the greed literature really does help us kind of frame some of the ways that we think about these, the way civil wars start, and some of the opportunities and structural conditions which contribute to both the beginnings of civil war, but also the sustaining of civil war. And that's something that we could also kind of think about too, is greed an explanation for civil war onset, or is it an explanation for civil war sustainability? And that's something we can get at. There might be grievances that start the civil war, but you're going to be able to continue them based on some of these greed explanations as well. So, the sort of the core argument that we're seeing then is that these civil wars, from sort of a greed perspective, are driven by individuals and collective groups who see incentives that allow them to enrich themselves more so than if they weren't participating within these revolutions. So we're going to move. So this is not a too long video. I try not to make them too long, but the next one is a too long video. You will be, and I'll explain it in the other video, but we're going to be reading the horizontal inequality article, so you'll get more of the discussion on grievances. But one thing to keep in mind as you're moving through this literature, and I think this sometimes is really hard for undergraduates who are being exposed for the first time to empirical explanations of political behavior, is that there are no monocausal explanations for any of this. What we do when we're doing research is we're trying to isolate one variable to try to understand its effect. And so that's why you can find multiple studies that point to different variables that explain something. All of them have a certain level of explanatory power to them. The trick is trying to figure out which one has the strongest explanatory power, whether or not we're able, what we think we're observing, whether or not we really are observing that. So these processes are extremely complex. They're driven by structures, but they're also driven by agency. And anytime you're bringing agency into any equation, it gets a little bit more problematic. And So we'll continue to come back to these ideas throughout the course, and each week we're going to be engaging different explanatory variables. So this is why I want you to gain a basic understanding of the research methods that we use to understand these phenomena, because it becomes a critical aspect of understanding this broad, complex literature. Okay, so I will see you guys in the other video. Pack some snacks, and I look forward to reading your weekly check-ins and looking at your note-taking worksheets for this week. Now remember, the note-taking worksheets is an exercise in note-taking. So that means you need to be thorough. You need to look at them as a project in which if you went back to those notes at the end of the semester or next semester or in a year, are those notes useful to you for understanding what the article you are reading was about? So keep that in mind as you're doing those worksheets. That's key, and that's what I'm going to be looking for as I'm grading. Okay, everyone, thanks for listening, and I'll see you on the other side. Bye.